Hello everyone, this is your Professor Taewei Wang. This lecture is a summary of Chapter 4 from the Spurrier and the Topi books. This chapter is about user stories and the user interface model. It is most importantly to the job that we are describing as a business analyst. Most likely, if you assume a job in the field of system analysis and design, as an entry-level person, you will be doing this type of job. It's called requirement gathering. And requirement gathering will be documented in user story and user interface model. This chapter introduced these two important jobs through the explanation of the framework that go with the textbook, as well as many examples of how to create, say, for example, a mock-up, and also the process of gathering user requirement from different methods. And let's take a very quick look on those jobs. One of the key assumptions of this particular textbook is that information system which we are analyzing and designing is actually a trigger for organization change. And every time we implement a new information system functions or application, it will trigger some sort of a behavior change inside the organization. And this change needs to be communicated between the person, maybe an end user, maybe a manager or a CEO. These persons need to communicate effectively of their idea to the system designer, the programmer, and something we call the system analyst. And these communications require a very skillful person to sit in the middle, and this is what we are doing here. And one of the words of caution is that the system design is not purely from the user's perspective, because a lot of time user does not really know what exactly to expect in a new information system. So with the new technology and the education to the user and raise the user expectation and imagination, it leads to a set of new organization process change and design. That's the process we're looking at. And over the past 20 years or so, through the analysis and design of many different methodology used in system development, we come up with this very high-level method that been commonly used by many business analysts already. And one is called the user story. In the UML world, user story is usually documented in the model called the use case model. And also we are trying to create some sort of a prototype design. And your textbook use the user interface model as this type of description. And here on this particular slide, we see a couple of terminology that you should be familiar with. The first couple is, of course, including user story and the user interface model. And I described earlier, one is the prototype we are trying to build. The other is pretty much the word descriptions of a functionality or feature for a particular system. And additional to these two terminology, you see there is a bold words called the epic. Epic is used from the meaning of the word. It is an important way of documenting the most important requirement for your system. It is also a way for you to define the scope and scale of your information system project. If you do not define epic, and then your project may have the problem we talked about earlier in a previous chapter, the creeping problem may come in. So the typical practice is we define a few epic and start our improvement project immediately and try to complete a epic project in maybe 1 week or 1 month. And later when we learn the methodological agile related methodology, an epic is usually leads to a week project or a month project in a Scrum methodology. From the textbook framework, the job that is done in user story and prototyping or user interface design is marked with a yellow color on the framework. The framework, I would encourage you to compare again to the Zachman framework we have studied and analyzed in our assignment. That they are similar in the way to present the important component of system development. And from the top to the bottom, you see a roughly project management process of top down from the higher level abstraction to a lower level detail. And you also have this from left to right, sort of like an intermediate iteration or process, try to achieve the goal in each individual step. And from top to the bottom, you can use a traditional terminology in system project we call the system development life cycle. From left to the right is usually something we consider as iterative development process. You go through a few going back and forth and try to correct and modify and try and error process and try to get to the end of the project. This method combines the top-down or system development life cycle and iterative process has become pretty much the norm for all the system development methodology already. So at the top level, we are building this user story to specify so-called the epic or initial requirement on the top. And for building this understanding of users' imagination or requirement of this user interface model, you're actually starting the design process of prescribe some sort of a functionality design already. So these two, you identify the higher level user requirement and match that with the user interface visualization. And this process of communicate with the user will probably be the best way of really try to coin down the requirement and have a good start for your project. And I cannot emphasize more about this going back and forth communication. You build a model, you show it to the user, and user responds, and to clarify their requirement. So at the beginning, the user may not have a very clear idea of what exactly are they expecting to do. They may have some sort of a sci-fi imagination of the new technology. But once we create this feedback loop, you can come up with a more solid user story definition. And also during the process of building this prototypes and soliciting users' imagination and requirement, and we are trying to make sure that you focus on the right thing. And a lot of time in the traditional learning of system analysis and design, the university or the academics focus too much on building this model. But as a matter of fact, modeling is not the goal or the purpose of the job we are doing or learning. It happened to be that it's not necessary to build model all the time, but model is only built when it is required. And this is called the intelligent model. So when you are working on the modeling assignment for the university job, like what we have in our semester, do remember that we are not trying to perfect the model. The goal is use this model and build in the process of building the model that you understand the system better, communicate the idea to the stakeholder better, and also that of course, in the learning process, you learn the notation of our UML language better in this process. So let's start by looking at user story first in this particular chapter. A user story is another way of writing a document that you might have interview from the user, might have do some other job, talking to the boss or manager or your client and get a note, a verbal notes of somewhere you write down, or maybe it's a voice recording. And you want to make those recording in a more formal format so you can document. And formal in a way it is essential. You do not capture a lot of noise during the conversation, but also the right to the point. So over time we have developed this concept called user story. The user story will become the foundation for use case model. and each user story will have a very short format. And this short format is following our system concept. System concept, even though we have not defined that very specifically, but usually we have this idea of a system that a system have input and going through some sort of process and generate output. So from user's perspective, a user look at the system. They want the system to do something for them and generate some sort of a result for them. So a general recipe of this user story we recommend for you to practice to write is you need to identify the user, and the user in the UML model will be called an actor. So this actor called the user role want to do something and want the system actually to do something for them. And what is the goal of this particular system? So this is an example that we see on this particular slide. A customer, which is the subject or the user, try to do something. What exactly the customer want to do? The customer want to have somebody or some system pick up the purchase accurately. So capture the purchase information accurately. So the result, the output will be a clear indication of this pickup. So it might be a receipt or a response or something. So a user require a pickup confirmation will be the example of this user story. So it seems like that the user story is typically described in one sentence. One sentence consists of a subject, which is the user, and a verb, that is the job that the user want to do, perform, or want the system to perform, and a result, which is the output or return of that particular job. Using UML model, the detail can be documented usually in a diagram such as activity diagram. And I believe at this particular point in time, you already have exposed to the some form of activity diagram through the understanding of flowchart. So you can see this as a flowchart. And we also learned that you want to use a more cross-functional flowchart to document this process. But in any case, you see there is a clear logic and this thing what we call a process to perform some sort of a job. And this job at the end of the result will have some solid goal or objective that has been achieved. So now we have this sort of like a use case called a collect item. For purchase purpose. So collect item is the verb, the job the system is actually trying to perform. And for purpose is actually leading to the next job. And for collect item to purpose, using a more physical way of looking at this thing is it seems like if you are doing this on a website, it could be putting things into a shopping cart. In the real world, in the physical world, you might be just a customer walking around in a store, try to pick up the stuff in their basket. So these explain the basic requirement for this particular system. And notice that I sort of like using that process to describe several different phenomena or situation. You can have a physical store or you can have a website. And this is one of the thing we do in the higher level modeling or the user story description. We try to make the user story high level or very abstract. Abstract means that you want to detach from the implementation detail. So the benefit of doing this is that these leave the designer of the system more options. For example, in this particular story, user story, users just want to collect the item somewhere so that we can continue to do purchase. And so that particular requirement later can be implemented into a lot of different things. Can be a kiosk, can be a smartphone application. But at this higher level design or requirement gathering, we do not want to prescribe that, oh, you have to use a kiosk or you have to use a smartphone. It can be any one of those or all of the above, but we want to leave these options open. So these are technical options. We want to keep it open. In the documentation process, we want to make this process more specific as possible, more detailed as possible. A lot of time you want to present several versions of this process because each time you try to describe a job, a process to perform some task. In this case, we are facilitating a purchasing behavior from the customer's perspective. There are always options. There are multiple versions. In the use case model, we will call them alternative course of action. But in initial user story description, you want to write down these processes as detailed as possible. So the first step to describe a user story is once you write down this one sentence user story, what user want to do to get something out of it, and then you try to specify that in more detail. And after that, you specify some sort of acceptance criteria. What is this criteria we use to evaluate once you design the process or build your information system what's considered to be good? And you put down these criteria here. An example of this user want to do the purchase, and the criteria is that you have to satisfy the acceptable of the user. Says okay, the user feel it's kind of clear for them to perceive for purchase and not ambiguous. So that would be the criteria to say that if your future design will be good or bad, and the requirement will become more clear in the user story. So once you have this criteria, then we can see an example. In this example, they have presented the acceptance criteria with a physical device, right? So we start with the user abstract concept, a user in a retail store that want to purchase something, collect something for purchase, but the user at the end says, okay, I want to use some sort of a portable device, and interestingly enough, they use the word portable device, not a smartphone, telling you that, okay, yeah, this is still not certain what kind of device are we using here. Are we using a cell phone or are we using some other things? And maybe I don't know, old technology or some sort of a kiosk that you can borrow from the store, or maybe that's a device hooked up to your shopping cart you can use on your shopping cart. So we don't know that yet, but there is a requirement already that specified by the user in a more specific format. And there are two additional criteria that you use to evaluate this particular requirement in the future design. One is called the accuracy, the other is called efficiency. And the complete story, again, is pay attention to here, one sentence. So you want to make sure that this user story is short, right to the point, with a measurement criteria, and that can be used for future design. And after you formalize and determine this particular user story is important, you write something what we call the epics. It is a user story that is it's actually summarized from different perspective and how they related to each other. So the example you see in this retail store, that you see that we figure out that not only the customer want to perform a job, there are corresponding other user such as general manager, or maybe another story, maybe the store clerk or the associate that helping the process can have a different requirement. So the combination or the summary of these set of action will be the epic story. The epic, again, is a very high-level abstraction. It's not directly used in the design process, but it will become some sort of a guiding principle that used to guide the direction and set up the boundary of your project. At the earlier stage of the user story construction or the requirement gathering, and one of the method to take this high-level abstraction user story down to earth is to create user interface model to facilitate the process of defining the real requirement. Because the abstract description a lot of time does not really corresponding to the real world situation. As human beings, such as you and me, we are still more accustomed to the thing we can see, we can touch. So bring the abstract concept down to the earth is actually one important skill that actually modern system developer need to do. Traditionally, in the ancient time, when I say ancient time, is in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, previous century. When we try to design a system, what we means that the information system professional usually rely a lot on this called a genius designer, say a Steve Jobs, that he has this vision of what the user want, and he or she will come up with this ingenious design everybody like. But in modern system development, we understand that you cannot rely on the genius design. We have to come up with a method. This method will be something that very fit into our human behavior. And this leads to a lot of this discipline we talk about in system development. These including user interface design, or a terminology we will hear a lot in our class called the user experience design. The abbreviation for that is UX. And user experience design, user interface design, and some other human interface design or human computer interface design, or HCI. All these terminology and discipline leads to this down to the earth and user focus sort of requirement. In this chapter, your textbook introduced three basic methods of user interface model design. So these three methods are wireframes, markup method, and the UI prototype. Wireframe is a concept used in earlier time of system development when building markup or graphic model is not that easy to build. And nowadays, fewer people are using wireframe already. Most likely we'll be using a markup and UI prototype because our programming tool today and some of the things we introduced in our class called low-code development environment already make the prototype building so easy. Almost a person with no programming training can easily build a prototype. So the need to build a wireframe is not as high. So we will focus more on the markup and the user prototype. In this chapter, your textbook focus on the markup method. So figure 4.3 here show you a typical markup application here. As you can probably see, it's just a description of something that's going to be showing up in your user interface. In this case, we are using a cell phone interface or smartphone interface design. And markup, the wireframe markup is pretty much using a simple geometric shape just to tell you what's going to be showing up on the user interface. And I comments on this. This is not used more often now in today's environment because it's really make no difference to create markup to create wireframe compared to the thing we are trying to focus here called the markup design. So the markup design will be something a lot of time we also call this non-functional prototype. So this is the prototype, pretty much like you're drawing a diagram on a paper, but in this case, of course, we'll be building this markup or non-functional prototype on a computer software system somewhere. And maybe it can be do in the VCO environment, the software we're using in our class. So you draw what you anticipate the user will look like when they are using this particular cell phone. And of course, the drawing will be some sort of a static. So you want to make some kind of an animation or a story about how these interface go through the process can support your user story. Now, in the company that I respect a lot and like a lot is the Disney. And the Disney, of course, they are also a movie making company. And when they are creating a movie, they usually come up with something what they call the storyboard. And this is the storyboard, an example when George Lucas was trying to create this epic movie called the Star Wars, and it's sort of like a comic book before they start making the movie. So they will draw this frame by frame or step by step in the movie story, try to tell the producer, or actually the producer try to tell the director what to expect and what to do, and convert from a script to a real story. And in information system design, believe it or not, we're using the same method as well. So this is the method, just pretty much going through the process. Traditionally use a wireframe model, try to describe the process. So you'll create multiple versions of the wireframe and put them into some sort of a flow chart process to describe how the user will go through in using this particular technology. And a lot of time you will create more generic, more specific diagram to show how the markup look like or prototype look like. Again, markup is a non-functional prototype. So in this case, they are telling you that this manager want to see a report of something from the profit and sales. So this is sort of like a dashboard report that you want to build. It's not functional yet. All these lines are imaginary. Just you can draw this by pencil or using a graphical tool to draw this markup. So wireframe or markup, you can put them into a more realistic form and show it to the user on paper or on computer. And put them into a process view of this user interface process. And then you can use this process to describe how the software will look like and present it to the user and collect information from the user to see if they like this or does not like that. And maybe a discussion among your project team to figure out, there might be, say, for example, wording issues, too many words in your buttons, and some of the words are insulting, culturally not fit. That sort of discussion can now be easily evoked from the project team or the user you try to talk to. And in chapter 3, we talk about you're building this high-level domain model, telling the system designer what are the important objects that need to be considered into this project. So you put the domain classes and object into this thing for consideration. So to refresh your memory, domain include the entity and attribute and their relationship that need to be described. So in here you see that we have managed product is an entity, then you have attribute, ID, name, product line, and so on and so forth show up in your user interface model as well. So this is kind of like a verification to see if your domain model and your markup or the prototype actually match your domain model. So every model you build, we have to make sure they are consistent. So now we see that domain model is consistent, need to be consistent with your user story, and the user story need to be consistent with your user interface model, and your user interface model describe all the necessary domain object you capture in your domain analysis. So if you're following the textbook logic so far, you come up with a very ambiguous project and organization view. Say our organization need to use the smartphone technology to improve our sale, a very high level goal into a very solid information system project by I want to create some sort of a system that I can help user to support the purchase of some kind. Once we have the user story defined and user interface model built, a lot of time domain model will also be built, then it is the time, very important step that we are doing in the earlier stage of our project, that is to perform a feasibility study. And there are many types of feasibility we want to consider: economically, financially, technical feasibility. Can we really do this or not? Or the schedule, time-wise, are we able to achieve the project as we expected? Politically, there are a lot of selection, software selection. For example, that now with the trade tension between the superpower, there are some political concern need to be considered. Operationally, can this be done in the operational environment we are doing this, and legal regulation and environmental and many other issues we need to consider. And this is actually a very complete list of the feasibility you should be conducting, and that is important that use this as a laundry list to go through. And one of the words of caution is that if you read a little bit detailed into a different type of feasibility, sometimes it's really hard to differentiate one feasibility with another. Without spending too much time here in our lecture, try to think about what are the difference between technical and operational feasibility. Are they sort of like related to each other? Or not. That's read the textbook and see if you can figure out the difference between them. But again, the emphasis here is that you have now at the higher level, early stage of your project, try to think about the feasibility of your project. Do not go into the project too long into the process, wasting too much time and energy and money and resources. Then you discover, well, it's not doable. You build something that is totally illegal, then it's just waste of time and money. And the earlier you capture the feasibility, the less likely you will be wasting your resource. And in the last part of the chapter, your textbook talk about the method of where you can discover this type of user story. And these are through a set of different type of process. And interview, survey, observations are the typical method. You go to an organization as a project team or maybe as a consulting firm, and the first thing you do is, of course, interviewing, send out survey, reading their organization document, and observe their organization, how people are doing job. In the 90s, there is a method called the joint application development has been created to formalize this process. The joint application development method, using the best analogy in the consumer world, is something what we call the pilot group study. So if you're familiar with the model a lot of larger companies are doing in the early 70s and 80s, company like GMP, PMG, Procter and Gamble, GE, they will all, and Gillette, they will do these consumer pilot behavior study. They will invite and hire a bunch of this pilot group and try to put them into a usability lab and design product and do a user test. JAD come up with a similar idea for software. So you put a group of developer, user, and system analyst into a team. And the job as a system analyst or business analyst is usually will be the team leader leading this group and conduct some sort of a brainstorming, or in this case, we don't call them brainstorming. Brainstorming is too primitive. It's a joint application design or development meeting. And this meeting has a very specific instruction on how you're going to be organizing, including how many people are going to be in the meeting, what kind of person should be in the meeting, how are you going to be design the meeting room, and that sort of instruction. That is one of the methods we collect the information or user story from a small group of users. And also, of course, the prototyping is using the process as I described earlier. So this process of using different sort of a small group meeting, interviewing, survey are all the method we use in collecting user story. And of course, for every project, you're not going to be using every one of this method. Depending on how important, how much resource you have, use a different method to collect the user story that require for you to build prototype and require for you to realize the vision of your project at the earlier stage of the project. And the requirement you gather from these type of method will usually be documented in a formal way. And these formal way are in use case model and activity diagram, or use together. And this is what you see in some of your assignment that might happen in your system analysis and design course. And you need to practice of how to use this language. And one comments I want to put in here is usually this is following the user story format. You have a subject, you have a verb, and you have some sort of outcome. So in here that you see you have an actor, you have some sort of action, and you have a justification of outcome evaluation of some kind. All these are related following the same logic of our user story, use case, or activity diagram convention. So in this case, you document your user story. You have 6 examples here. Each one of them might be converted into a use case in your use case model. And sometimes you will build a mock-up model together with your interface to communicate with the user. And these models will be helpful in terms of collecting the real feedback before you are actually spend time to write program building these modules or purchase programs sometimes. So properly use the user interface model, the user story, the requirement collective method, and of course the feasibility study. In the process, you're going back and forth between these two models in a typical project cycle, and you come up with a pretty good story that you consider to be a deliverable in the process, such as the mock-up model that we're seeing here, will be a pretty good achievement and intermediate milestone for your project. And that is what the textbook is trying to tell you in chapter 4. Again, user story and the user interface model going back and forth, and we do some feasibility study, and that conclude the earlier stage of our system requirement gathering. And that's the end of chapter 4.